Today we're going to talk a little bit about consumption. This is the material from chapter 19. So we're going to jump all the way from chapter 2 to chapter 19. And we're going to do this to try to get some micro foundations for some of the macro that we're going to do. All of economics was micro until 1930, give or take, until Keynes comes in and writes his general theory. However, there were explorations into issues that have moved over to the realm of what we call macroeconomics. So there are explorations into capital and investment and things like that. Chapter 19 is interesting in the discussion of investment and consumption because for the most part it excludes the interest rate. And we would typically want to use the interest rate as a price, a time price for money. So the interest rate is the time price of money. In my intro course, I include a short essay that I once wrote called Gumballs Now or Ice Cream Later. And the story goes like this. My kids and I were coming out of the grocery store one day, and there's a gumball machine right outside the grocery store. They put that there to torture parents. And so my younger daughter's like, Papa, can we have a gumball, please? And I said, you can either have a gumball now or you can have ice cream later. Oh, a dilemma. Because I had both kids with me, right? Now, truth be told, both of my daughters prefer ice cream to gumballs. So both of them should have said, okay, I'll wait for the ice cream, right? Well, there's a problem because I could be talking about ice cream now, a gumball now, or ice cream later, or a gumball later. Now, both of them would rank ice cream over gumballs if they could have them now. And if it were just later that we were comparing, they would still prefer ice cream later over a gumball later. So gumball later is absolutely the lowest ranking. Ice cream now is the highest ranking, but they differ in between. So my older daughter preferred to have ice cream later over having a gumball now, but my younger daughter preferred having the gumball now over having the ice cream later. De gustibus non est disputandum. There's no accounting for tastes or preferences. There's nothing wrong with this. But it indicated that my younger daughter had a shorter time horizon. She preferred something now to something later, even something that she liked more. She'd rather have this now than that later. This is the fundamental foundation for the concept of interest rates. It's about time preferences. It's about time preferences. How long are you willing to wait? When do you want to do your consumption? Now or later? Eugen Boboverk was an Austrian economist who developed this understanding of the interest rate. And it was a big part of how we understood decisions to be made by people within society. Keynes comes along in the middle of the recession, or the depression really, and wants to understand how people are allocating whatever money they get between consumption and savings. And interestingly, he calls it savings, not investment. Why does he care? He's looking for a way to stimulate people's economic activity, to boost aggregate demand, to get us out of the Depression. Why does Keynes care so much about getting us out of the Depression? If we're in a depression, who are people going to blame?
Each other.
Each other and the government, right? It's two, at least. Now, they might blame the government as some faceless entity out there, or they might put the blame on whatever form of government they're currently living under. So in the United States and in Great Britain, the form of government was somewhat democratic, somewhat representative, definitely capitalist in the rhetoric of the time. So people were turning away from democracy, liberal government, capitalism, towards socialism and fascism. And Keynes was worried. He was like, I don't want to go the socialist communist route. I don't want us to go the fascist route, although he was a eugenicist himself. Instead, he said, I want to preserve liberal democracy, primarily because he was upper crust liberal democracy, and he wanted to maintain his own position as, let's be a little more benevolent towards Keynes than that, okay? Let's just presume that he was worried about political turmoil, wanted to avoid it for the sake of preserving either the status quo or the benefit of everyone. Let's be generous towards him in that sense. So he's looking for a way to boost us out of the Depression to prevent political turmoil. And that is probably the most generous reading I can give Keynes on that issue. So he starts to think about how is it that people engage in consumption. Now, if you have a certain amount of income, how much of your income are you going to consume? This is where the puzzle begins. If you consume your entire income, we'd be talking about a basic 45-degree angle here, wouldn't we? You're consuming everything that you earn. Do most people consume everything that they earn? Well, it depends, doesn't it? It depends on how much you got. Right now, you're probably consuming more than you earn. Some of you are taking on student loans. So in that sense, you're consuming more than you earn. And for some people, there's a minimum level of consumption. What happens if you don't reach your minimum level of consumption? You get dead. You don't have enough consumption to stay alive. So there is a minimum level of consumption. And Keynes says, you know what? People don't consume everything that they earn. Instead, I think that there is what you might call a marginal propensity to consume. So what's this area called? Between that which you consume and that which you earn. Savings. So this area is savings. Where do people put their savings? Not during the Depression. What happened during the Depression? Banks all failed, right? There's nowhere to put. That doesn't count. But I did get one earlier. Banks all failed. So there's fewer places to put your savings. People were putting it under their mattresses in many cases. So for Keynes, if you're putting your money under the mattress, is it earning interest? No. So here we see why Keynes does not include the interest rate in his version of savings. He thinks that there is a broken joint between savings and investment. For the rest of us, for times when we're not in a depression, we pretty much have a situation like this. We have a choice between consume now and consume later. Don't we? Now, how might I illustrate the trade-off between consuming now and consuming later? What kind of a graph would that look like? You've seen a graph like this before, but maybe not for this application. How would you think about doing this? It's similar to if you have a limited amount of resources, right, consuming coconuts or consuming fish. Which are you going to do? It's a production possibility frontier. A trade-off between consuming now or consuming later. Gumball now, ice cream later. Where would we put gumball later? Maybe here, right? Something like that. Now, you make a decision. You decide, I'm going to consume this much now and consume this much later. That's my trade-off. That's my choice. Given that choice, which is purely based on your preferences, it's your time horizon, we draw a line tangent to this curve. That line is a reflection of the relative price of consumption now in terms of foregone consumption later. The money is the consumption later. I'm not saying you consume money later. I'm saying that the numeraire in this illustration is consumption later. You're giving up consumption now in order to have consumption later. The trade-off at this point is a ratio between the amount of consumption now to the consumption later. It's a price. It's the time price. It's the time price of money. It is the interest rate. Are you seeing the foundations of this? Typically, you can consume more later if you consume less now. It increases. The farther you go in this direction, right, the more you're able to consume later, which is to say that the ratio, the price changes. If you're more willing to forego consumption now for consumption later, we say that your discount rate is lower. The interest rate is lower. The interest rate is more steep. You still with me? Okay. But there's no interest rate in Keynes. So to express what Keynes does here, we can do so algebraically. We can say that consumption today is equal to some constant level of consumption, plus little c times y. Little c being some number between 0 and 1, meaning a percentage, a share of your income. So you have sort of the minimum level of consumption that you can have, that you can live with, and then you have little c, a share of your income times your income. So in your textbook, first of all, it doesn't show this 45-degree angle to help us understand what's actually happening here. But it does give this equation. Now, as we increase our income, our overall consumption also increases, but not at the rate that our income is increasing. It doesn't keep pace. If it did, we would be on the 45-degree angle. Some of our income goes to savings instead. So we can see our consumption And we have illustrated on here our marginal propensity to consume. What's not on the graph so far is our average propensity to consume. To calculate an average, we would simply want to know what is the average level of consumption. Well, it would be, make sure I've got this right. It would be what proportion of my income am I consuming? Big C. If I have zero income, I can have zero consumption. So it would be here. But it's always going to be, if this is my level of consumption, and this is my level of income, it's going to be this ratio. Or in other words, it's going to be the line that goes from the origin to the marginal propensity to consume curve. What happens to my average propensity to consume as my income increases?
Goes down.
It goes down. Can you draw it? Try to draw it and then see if you get it right. I'll show you in a second. But you got to try first. So we're always going to draw a line from the origin to our marginal propensity to consume. So if this is my income and this is my consumption, this would be my average propensity to consume. The angle is different from the marginal propensity to consume, always. The farther out we go, the more similar the slopes of the two lines become. They'll never be exactly the same, but I mean, the farther out we go, the better, right? This isn't in your book, but I'm thinking about it now, so I'm going to say it, which means it could be totally wrong. You tell me. What's that? What is our minimum consumption? What is the least that you can live on without getting dead?
Food and water.
Food and water, basically. And so historically, we've seen that unless a person gets about $3 a day, they have a really hard time surviving. $3 a day is bare subsistence survival level. And there are many places in the world still living on $3 a day, but fewer and fewer. So most of us, if the 45-degree line is right here, and here's $3 a day, where are most of us? How much are most of us living on per day? If you make $10 an hour, $8, 8 hours a day, that's $80 a day. That's 3, where's 80? Over here somewhere? Probably farther. And that's not even where most people are, is it? The median income is around $50,000 a year, which would be $25 a day, or $25 an hour, which is over here somewhere. Once you get all the way over to here, that marginal propensity to consume and average propensity to consume lines would be really, really similar in their slopes. Really hard to tell the difference, wouldn't it? And that's what we would expect to happen, but that's not what's actually observed. Instead, what seems to happen is that as the society we find ourselves in becomes more and more wealthy, we tend to treat the minimum that we can get by on as a lot higher. Man, I couldn't get by on anything less than $30 a day. And the wealthier you become, the more you ratchet that up. Are you with me? Does that ring true to you? I think so. Again, part of what I'm interested in is maintaining some perspective on these things, which is to say, we are all incredibly wealthy beyond our full understanding. So our average propensity to consume can be described by this equation. But if we take this equation for capital, then we can restate our average propensity to consume as our minimum plus a share of our income. And then we do algebra, don't we? Because we're in economics class, so we're going to do algebra. So then we're going to say, okay, well that's equal to C bar over Y plus little c. Again, where's R? Or I? The interest rate. It's not on there, is it? Inflation isn't even included. They're not considered here. If income goes up and people maintain this same level of marginal propensity to consume, and income keeps on growing, what happens to savings? It gets bigger and bigger and bigger. It becomes a larger and larger share of your income. What could happen? Can savings be too high? No. When Keynes was looking at the Great Depression, what he saw was a lot of underutilized resources. What do you call an underutilized resource? What does that mean, an underutilized resource? Going back to the production possibility frontier for all goods, how would we demonstrate we could be here but we're not? Underutilized resources would mean we're in here somewhere, right? So we're not on our production possibility frontier. To put that in aggregate demand, aggregate supply, we would say for some reason we're over here. We're not meeting our full potential, which means that we have unemployment. Of what? Not just people, but also capital, resources. In other words, inventory. Higher and higher levels of inventories. This is how this was talked about, which is to say, how do you get a lot of extra inventory? By having a lot of extra savings. So Keynes was concerned that if this is people's true marginal propensity to consume, and as income goes up, savings would go up, and we would create a new situation where we have underutilized resources. This comes out of an idea from Robert Thomas Malthus, who called it a general glut. A general glut is not me at a buffet. Well, maybe it is. But a general glut means we've just got too much of everything. And so people are going to stop working in the short run until we use up some of what we have. So if this is the case, then we could get concerned as incomes go up. We might cause another general glut, which would lead to another Great Depression. It's called a secular stagnation. A secular stagnation which leads to indefinite depression. This is the concern. So Keynes is worried about this, and he's trying to think about, well, how can we overcome this problem? But before overcoming the problem, we have to first describe it, and this is what he was trying to do to describe it. Is this the right way to describe what's happening? How would we know? Here's the theory. How do we know if it's true? trick question. You never know that a theory is true. You just know whether it's been falsified or not yet. We have a hypothesis that we're going to want to test, so we're going to collect some data. We want to collect some data to find out if this model seems to reflect empirically what we observe people doing in the real world. Problem: there wasn't any data. Data had not yet been collected. They weren't really collecting GDP data yet at the time. They weren't collecting those kinds of statistics. So, what happens? We get our homeboy, Simon Kuznets. Kuznets wins the Nobel Prize. Why? Because he started collecting the data. And he developed the accounting tools for collecting that data so that they would be consistent, which is what we did last week with GDP and unemployment. He's the one who developed the basic rules for doing this and was among the first to actually do it. He collects some data, and then some people take his data and hold it up against Keynes's model, and they say, it's not quite right. This isn't holding up. Not always. In the short run, this seems to work. In the long run, it seems a little bit off. How would you even know? What kind of data would you need to have to be able to do this? You'd either want to be able to follow a particular individual over their lifetimes and look at them when they have different levels of income and see how they respond in terms of the amount of money that they spend and how much they spend from that income as their income changes. Or you would want to look at a whole bunch of different people at the same time and compare people who have lower incomes and higher incomes and see how they behave. The latter doesn't really give us the time element, the short run versus the long run perspective that we're looking for. The earlier one doesn't account for differences amongst individuals as much. So it's a difficult task. In economics it always is. One way to say this is that you never find the data you want. Right? But when you're trying to do an economic study of some sort, the best way to go about it is to imagine theoretically what the best possible data would be to complete your project. And I promise you're not going to find it. You're not going to find it. So then you go looking for the next best thing. You have to, when you reach that point, you have to be very straightforward and honest about the limitations of whatever data it is that you can collect. Usually you can't say as much as you want to. All of econometrics is about developing new identification strategies to make use of bad data to try to understand things that are happening in the real world, making the best out of a bad situation. Doesn't even deal with the fact that that there are problems in collecting the data. That even when you do find some data, it's kind of wacky. So Keynes's model worked for household data in the short run, but not in the long run. It couldn't explain that ratcheting element that I pointed to earlier. It didn't have that included. So it didn't match all of the data all the time. What are we going to do? We need a new theory. So Kuznets has brought us the data, now we need a new theory. How can we think about this? Along comes Franco Modigliani. Modigliani proposes a life cycle hypothesis. I often give a quick version of the life cycle hypothesis when I'm teaching intro macro. What I do there is I ask you to think about your own lives and how you're going to earn and spend over the course of your own lives. So you start out very, very young. And when you're young, what are your earnings? 0. You have no earnings. Until when? I don't know, until you get to be 17, 16, 15 years old, when you get your first job. And then you start to earn some money. Now, luckily for you, all of your consumption up until that point in time is also paid for by somebody else, supposedly. But then you start to earn some money, and your earnings increase. But you have a certain level of consumption. All right, I'm just going to put money here. This is your level of consumption, this is your life or time. You have a certain level of consumption that you're used to. And actually, this is ridiculous. You're not going to get there for a while. You're going to hit a barrier. You're going to have that barrier at first that says you don't have a high school education, so that's the most you can earn. Then you're going to, later on, hit another barrier that says, well, you do have a high school education, but that's all, so that's the most that you can earn. If you don't go to college, what has to happen? You have to adjust your consumption. You have to ratchet your consumption down so that you can live. Suppose you do go to college. Your income will increase. When does your income increase? Does it increase after your first semester of college? No. Does it increase after your 4th semester of college? No. Does it increase after your 7th semester of college? Not really. If you take 3.5 years of university and drop out, you're still here. And you're never going any higher. Why is that the case? You're supposedly developing skills while at university. Supposedly you're learning something useful, especially in this class. So why is it that until you get that piece of paper, it doesn't matter? Yeah?
They have no proof of your skills.
They have, but you could maybe show them a portfolio. A lot of the value of university is signaling that you finished. Your income after finishing university increases dramatically. It's called the sheepskin effect because it used to be that they would print your diploma on sheepskin. It would last longer. The sheep didn't last long, but okay. So then, between the time that you become financially independent, whenever that is, and the time that you graduate university, you are borrowing. You get student loans. And it could even be the case that after graduation, you're still not earning very much. You're in your first job after university, you still might not be earning enough to pay for your cost of living. It's not until some other point, maybe in your mid-20s or 30s, that you finally are earning more than your quality of life. And then as you improve, you move up within your career, your income goes up and up and up. And for a while, what's all this? What's that time period called?
Retirement?
Not yet, no. You're still moving up in the world. But what are we doing during this time period? Yes?
You saving?
Not yet, you're not saving. You're paying off your student loans. You're paying off your student loans, right? I'm still paying off my student loans. I went to college for 14 years, okay? So that was maybe not the best decision, but now you're stuck with me. So yeah, so you're paying off your student loans. If you're teaching at a university or in education of any kind, they let you just pay a percentage of your income, and after 10 years, they forgive the rest of the debt. I'm torn. I could get a better job, but then I'd have to pay more off of my loan. Would I actually be able to keep that money? I don't know. All right. So then, from then on, what are you doing? Now you're saving up so that when you do retire, you have money to live off of or to give to your kids. So this is paying back, and then this is saving, and then this is sometimes called dis-saving, or using up your savings. Now we've observed a couple of things that have happened. It's getting very messy up here. A couple of things have happened. One is that people planned on this being around 75. What's that? That's when you die. People were planning on dying at age 75. That's no longer the case. Instead, what should I put? How long do you expect to live? What age do you expect to be when you die? None of you is Tupac, so how old do you expect to be when you die? How many of you expect to live to be 80? 90? 100? I, personally, fully expect to live to be 100 years old. And I'm not in the best health. Why? Medicine is amazing. The quality of medical care that we have today is very, very, very good. If you're not planning on living to be 100, you should update your priors. It's a should, but it's very, very common to live to be 100 now. And you might want to adjust your expectations. As a result, what's happening? Because we're living to be 100, what's happening? People are continuing to work into their 70s. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? It's up to you, isn't it? It's up to you. Personally, I, again, also fully plan to keep on working until I croak. I love what I do, so that's kind of nice. That doesn't mean necessarily I'm going to be standing in a bunch of students like this, forget y'all, but I continue to plan on doing economics until I die. Ronald Coase won the Nobel Prize for some of his work. He died, I think, at 102, and he had just published a book that year. At 102 years old. The faculties were all still with him. So what Modigliani here is saying is that people tend to pick a level of consumption and stick with it over their life cycle. They have a certain expectation about what quality of life they expect to live, and that's what they're at. Does that seem true to you? Not quite. I don't think that's 100% true either, right? I think that what happens is that people do this. I mean, sometimes people do this, right? Sometimes people be dumb. Humans are the only species that says, hold my beer. But oftentimes we do increase our consumption as our income goes up, especially if we find ourselves earning more than we expected to, which is the point. You probably have in your mind somewhere, I expect to be earning after I graduate university or grad school, whatever level you plan to get to. Once I'm at a certain level in my life, I expect to be earning thus and such amount. Maybe you expect to be earning $70,000 a year. Maybe you expect to be earning $210,000 a year. It's not that far from the scope of things. It's not that far out there. It really isn't. People look at me funny when I give numbers like that, but look, people make that much money. It happens. Oh, you are going to want to be wise. And to be completely normative for a moment or two, I have this little pulpit. I'll use it. I consider frugality a virtue. Why? Because Keynes was wrong. Savings is not going to generate a general glut. Savings is going to increase the amount of investment in new ideas and new technologies. It's going to increase everyone's capacity to consume in the long run. Savings is where wealth comes from in the long run. How can we algebraically express Modigliani's consumption smoothing ideally? We can say consumption is equal to your wealth, which is sort of an endowment that you receive, plus the number of years you plan to work before times your income every year that you are working before you retire, all divided by the number of years you expect to be alive. You can think about it like this. I'm going to consume something in year 1. I'm going to consume something in year 2. I'm going to consume something in year 3. I'm going to consume every year until I die. What am I going to consume? Well, I'm going to consume my wealth plus my income in year 1, plus my income in year 2, plus my income in year 3, plus my income every year until the year, not that I die, but that I retire. So, what you don't want to do is have no money left at the end of your life. Or you don't want to have more years than you have retirement saved for. There's ways around it. You could reach the peak of your savings and buy an annuity, and then you could just live off your annuity from then on, and then it doesn't matter how long you live. That's insurance, basically. Let's do what we do when we write up an algebraic equation. Let's transform it and mess with it. First, let's distribute time. So we can say that consumption is equal to your wealth divided by time, the number of years that you live, plus the number of years until you retire, divided by the number of years until you die, times your income. We just distributed that time through. Maybe an example would be helpful here. We're going to take this term and call it alpha. We're going to take this term and call it beta. Alpha, we're going to say, is your marginal propensity to consume of your wealth. And beta is your marginal propensity to consume of your income. So let's plug some numbers in and see what happens. Let's suppose that time is 50. So you're going to live another 50 years. You're going to retire in 30 years. Let's say you inherited $100,000. Must be nice. And that you expect to have an income of $20,000 a year. It's $10 an hour. Okay. How much can you consume every year? how much can you consume every year and run out of money on the day you die? So you could plug this in, couldn't you? So I can consume $100,000 divided by 50 years plus 30/50ths of my income, which is $20,000. 100,000 divided by 50 is what? So 10,000 divided by 50 is 2,000. And 60% of 20,000 is 12,000. So every year I can consume $14,000. That's my consumption level year over year. Now what's funny about this is that I'm earning $20,000 a year, and I'm treating it as if I'm taking $2,000 out of my retirement fund and then putting another $6,000 back in for every year until I retire. After which point I'm not putting any more in anymore, which is why you get a number like 14,000. Again, what's missing? You're not getting any interest on the money that you have saved. So we're treating the interest rate as 0 for the purposes of simplifying the model so that we can understand it. It works out that at year 30, when year's 30, how much money will you have in the bank? You'll have taken out 30 years at $2,000, so 2,000 times 30, 0, 0, 0, 0. You'll have taken out $60,000, but every year you'll have put in 40% of your $20,000, right? So you take 20,000 times, well, the difference there is simply, I think, $8,000 between 20 and 12. So you take $8,000 for 30 years, transposed. So plus $24,000, so 60 plus 24, you're at $300,000 the year that you retire, and then you just use it up until you die.